The wind was a blade, honed on the jagged peaks of the mountains and driven into the heart of the valley. It flayed the last stubborn leaves from the skeletal branches of the aspens, sending them skittering across the frozen earth like frightened mice. For Mei Ling, the cold was more than a sensation. It was a presence, a living thing that had crept under her worn wool coat, settled deep within her bones, and now resided in the hollow space where hope used to be. Every breath was a shard of ice in her lungs. Beside her, huddled under the same thin blanket in the lee of their broken-down handcart, her sister Shufang shivered, her sobs having long ago frozen into silent, chattering despair. Their world had been reduced to this bleak tableau. A crippled cart with one wheel shattered beyond repair, two emaciated mules that stared blankly at the unforgiving landscape, and a sky the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of more snow. The men, her husband, Shufang's husband, the others in their small party who had promised a new life in the West, were gone. They had taken the horses, the best of the supplies, and left the two women with the broken cart and the mules, deeming them burdens too heavy for the arduous path ahead. They had called it a temporary measure, a practical decision. They would send for them from the settlement, they'd said. Mei Ling knew the truth. They were left to die. That was 3 weeks ago. The meager sack of rice was now a handful of dust, the salted fish a memory of a taste. The cold was the true predator here, and it was closing in. "We will freeze," Shufang whispered, her voice a dry rasp. It was not a complaint, but a statement of fact, a final surrender. Her eyes, usually so bright with mischief and impatience, were dull, fixed on the gray horizon as if awaiting a formal invitation from death. Mei Ling did not answer. Words were a currency she could no longer afford to spend. Instead, she scanned the oppressive wall of pine and fir that climbed the mountainside, a dark, dense forest that seemed to swallow the very light. It was there, just as dusk began its final, cruel bleed across the sky, that she saw it. A thread of smoke, thin and pale against the darkening canvas, rising from deep within the woods. It was an impossible sight, a ghost of a signal in a world she had believed to be utterly empty of humanity. Hope, she discovered, was a stubborn, foolish thing. It flickered in her chest, a tiny, painful ember. "Look," she said, her own voice startling her with its roughness. She pointed with a hand so numb she could barely feel it. Shufang followed her gaze. Her eyes widened, but the flicker of life was quickly extinguished by a new wave of fear. Who would live there? In that forest? No prospector, no trapper would build a fire so deep in the woods. Not with this winter coming on. It is a spirit, Mei Ling, a forest demon. A fire is warmth, Mei Ling stated, the simple logic a rock to cling to in a sea of terror. And where there is fire, there is wood. We have no axe. Ours broke last week. We cannot survive the night without a fire. The cold was already beginning its nightly siege, its tendrils creeping with a renewed, vicious intensity. The mules shuddered, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The decision was not a decision at all. It was the last twitch of a dying organism. To stay was certain death. To go toward the smoke was a chance, however slim, however terrifying. She pulled Shufang to her feet, the younger sister's body limp and unresisting. "We must," Mei Ling insisted, her voice harder than she intended. She would not let them perish here, a forgotten footnote in the snow. She would drag her sister, drag herself, toward that fragile column of smoke. The journey into the forest was a descent into a primeval world. The trees grew so close together their branches interlocked overhead, creating a perpetual twilight. The wind, which had been a roar in the open valley, became a low, mournful moan as it navigated the labyrinth of ancient trunks. Snow lay in deep, pristine drifts, and with every step, Mei Ling's thin-soled shoes sank, the icy powder seeping in to melt against her skin. She half-carried Shufang, whose fear seemed to have sapped the very strength from her limbs. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and their own ragged breathing. It felt like they were trespassing, violating a place that had long ago forgotten the tread of human feet. They smelled the wood smoke long before they saw the source, a rich, resinous scent of burning pine that spoke of a hearth, of shelter, of life. It guided them through the gloaming, a beacon for the damned. Finally, the trees thinned, and they stumbled into a clearing that was less a clearing and more a small, deliberate wound in the heart of the forest. And there, built into the side of a low, moss-covered hill, was a cabin. It was a structure born of the forest itself, not imposed upon it. The walls were made of logs so immense Mei Ling could not fathom how a man, or even a team of men, could have lifted them. The roof was a thick layer of earth and sod, from which hardy mountain grasses grew, now brown and dormant. It looked less like a building and more like a natural formation, an ancient den for some great beast. The smoke they had followed rose from a chimney of river stones, each one the size of a winter melon. A faint golden light emanated from a single window, covered not with glass, but with some kind of stretched, oiled hide that glowed with a warm, translucent pulse. Shufang whimpered and pulled back, her fingers digging into Mei Ling's arm. "No, this is no man's house. We should go back." But Mei Ling's gaze was fixed on the figure standing near the woodpile beside the cabin. The scale of the dwelling had prepared her for something unusual, but not for this. He was a giant. There was no other word for it. He stood a full head and a half taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders as broad as the broken cart they had left behind. He was dressed in crudely stitched hides and wore a thick, dark beard that covered much of his face. He was in the process of splitting a log, but he held the axe, a massive, formidable tool, as if it were a child's toy. He brought it down, and the log cleaved in two with a sound that was less a crack and more a deep, resonant boom that echoed in the clearing. He stopped then, his work finished, and slowly turned his head, as if he had sensed their presence all along. He did not seem surprised. His eyes, deep set beneath a heavy brow, found them in the shadows at the edge of the trees. They were dark and unreadable, but Mei Ling did not see malice in them. She saw a stillness, a profound and ancient solitude, like that of a mountain that has stood alone for millennia. He simply watched them, his great chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. Fear was a cold knot in Mei Ling's stomach, but desperation was a fire that burned hotter. She took a step forward, pulling a trembling Shufang with her. She did not know the language of this land well, her words clumsy and heavily accented, but she knew the universal language of need. She bowed her head, a gesture of respect and supplication. "Sir," she began, her voice small in the vast, silent clearing. We are in need. Our fire is gone. We have no axe. We only ask for some wood, just enough for one night. We will be gone by morning." The giant did not move. He did not speak. He only watched them, his gaze shifting from Mei Ling's face to Shufang's terrified one, and then back again. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind in the pines. For a moment, Mei Ling was certain this was the end. He would turn them away, or worse, he would treat them as the forest treated all weak things, with cold, brutal indifference. Then, with a movement that was surprisingly fluid for a man of his size, he turned, bent down, and gathered a staggering armful of the split logs, more than she and Shufang could have carried together. He walked toward them, his footsteps heavy and sure on the frozen ground. He stopped a few paces away, his shadow engulfing them completely, and gently, carefully, he laid the wood at their feet. He had not said a word. He simply provided, and in that silent, generous act, in the deep, lonely quiet of his eyes, Mei Ling felt not the terror of a monster, but the profound, aching sorrow of a man who had been alone for a very, very long time. As if summoned by their desperation, the sky finally broke. The snow began not as gentle flakes, but as a thick, driving curtain of white, a blizzard that descended upon the forest with sudden, shocking ferocity. The wind howled, whipping the snow into a blinding frenzy, and the world beyond the small clearing was erased in an instant. The wood at their feet, their prize of survival, was already being covered. The thought of returning to their exposed camp was no longer just daunting. It was impossible. They would lose their way in minutes, wander until they fell, and be buried by morning. Xu Fang let out a small, terrified cry, clutching at Mei Ling's sleeve. The giant, Kalin, who had turned to go back inside his home, paused. He looked back at them, then up at the maelstrom engulfing the forest. His expression remained unreadable, carved from the same stoic material as the mountains around them, but a subtle shift occurred in his posture. He seemed to deliberate for a moment, his gaze fixed on the swirling chaos. Then he turned fully back toward them. He did not speak. He simply raised one enormous hand and gestured toward the heavy wooden door of his cabin. It was an unmistakable invitation. Xu Fang shook her head violently. "No, Mei Ling, we cannot. It is a trap. It is shelter," Mei Ling countered, her voice sharp with the bitter clarity of their situation. "Outside is death. Inside is a chance." She looked at the giant, meeting his steady gaze. She saw no deception there, only a quiet acknowledgement of the storm's power and their own fragility. He was not luring them in. He was offering a reprieve from the elemental fury that would surely claim them. With a resolve that surprised even herself, Mei Ling bent and picked up a few pieces of the gifted wood, a symbolic gesture of accepting his help but not his charity. She walked toward the door, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm against her ribs. The giant stepped aside to let them pass, holding the massive door open. The air that washed over them from inside was a miracle. It was warm, thick with the smell of pine smoke, roasting meat, and drying herbs. It was the scent of life. The interior of the cabin was a single, cavernous room. The scale of it was breathtaking. The ceiling, supported by whole tree trunks, was high above their heads. A fire blazed in a hearth so large a man could stand inside it, casting flickering shadows that danced across the rough-hewn wooden walls. Everything was built for his size. A table and a single massive chair were carved from enormous stumps. A bed in the far corner was a mountain of furs and hides. Yet, despite its size, the space was not crude. It was orderly, meticulously kept. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, each one clean and in its place. Bundles of dried herbs were tied to the rafters. Intricate carvings of animals, deer, bears, eagles, adorned the posts and the mantelpiece. This was not the lair of a mindless beast. It was the home of a craftsman, a solitary man who took pride in his world, however small and isolated it might be. He closed the door behind them, and the roar of the blizzard was instantly muted to a distant, frustrated howl. The sudden silence was almost as overwhelming as the noise had been. He gestured toward the fire, another silent command for them to warm themselves. Mei Ling and Xu Fang crept forward, drawn to the heat like moths to a flame, holding out their frozen hands to the blessed warmth. Mei Ling watched him as he moved about the room. His movements were deliberate, economical, and possessed a strange, quiet grace. He took a cast-iron pot from a hook by the fire, ladled a thick, fragrant stew into 2 wooden bowls that were comically large for them but were clearly his normal serviceware, and placed them on the floor near the hearth, along with 2 roughly carved spoons. He did not join them. Instead, he retreated to his large chair in the shadows on the other side of the room, leaving them to their meal, watching them with that same intense, silent curiosity. Xu Fang was too terrified to eat, but Mei Ling, driven by a hunger that was a physical pain, picked up the bowl. The stew was rich with venison, wild mushrooms, and root vegetables. It was the most nourishing thing she had tasted in months. Each spoonful was a reassurance, a small victory against the death that waited outside. She nudged her sister. "Eat," she urged softly. "He means us no harm. If he did, we would already be dead." Slowly, hesitantly, Xu Fang began to eat. As the warmth of the food spread through her, some of the tension eased from her shoulders. The 2 sisters ate in silence, acutely aware of the giant watching them from the shadows. He was a constant, immense presence, yet he made himself scarce, effacing his own being within his own home to give them space. It was a courtesy so profound and unexpected it touched Mei Ling deeply. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the hide covered.